Welcome everybody to Come Together Ontario for the Climate Citizens Climate Lobbies event on October 4th, 2015. Yesterday was the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, just pointing that out to everyone. So that's pretty cool considering what the Pope's been doing, and we're in a religious building. I'm going to cut this very short. I just want to say that we're excited here tonight to have Jeff Rubin as our keynote speaker. His book, The Carbon Bubble, What Happens When It Bursts, and his editorials in the Globe and Mail have been an important touchstone for us. It was a very empowering day when you said yes. Thank you so much. And we're also quite thrilled to have Tom Chervinsky here from Clean Prosperity. When you accepted our invitation to give a guest speaker invitation to help us communicate across party lines, again, super thrill across Canada. It was both of you. Thank you so much for dedicating to us. And I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. You are one in a million, truly, all of you. There's 35 million people in Canada, and there's 33 about you here tonight. Okay, good. I got a laugh out of you. So without further ado, okay, so Jeff Rubin is going to give a presentation and discussion on carbon taxes and tariffs. Jeff Rubin was the chief economist at CIBC World Markets for 20 years. His most recent book, published in May 2015, The Carbon Bubble, What Happens When It Bursts, addresses Canada's national economic future and the financial security of all Canadians. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. I don't think I need. Thank you very much. Let me just talk to you for a moment about bubbles, and then I'll talk to you about what policies make sense to deal with the bubble that we're dealing with right now.
Use the microphone here so it goes to broadcast.
Okay.
Thank you.
Y'all remember when you were kids and dipped a plastic wand in some dishwashing detergent or soap detergent, went out in your backyard and created little effervescent spheres that seemed to defy gravity, glistening in the sunlight, and then poof, they disappeared as quickly as they came. Well, bubbles aren't just something that little kids play with in their backyards. Bubbles are, in fact, a very common feature of our economy, more common than I think most of us would recognize. In my tenure as a chief economist of an investment bank, I was in the midst of three bubbles. There was, of course, the dot-com bubble at the turn of the millennium. There was the subprime mortgage bubble about 6-7 years later. And now there's what I would call the carbon bubble. And all of these bubbles were based on some fundamental premise or assumption that turned out to be false. In the case of the carbon bubble, it's the assumption that we can combust and emit as much carbon as we wish into the atmosphere to power economic growth. And I think that in the last 10 years, if not longer, we've discovered that that's not true for two reasons. One, the economic constraint. Two, the environmental constraint. The economic constraint is that the kind of energy prices that we need to secure ever greater sources of supply, and this is particularly true of the world's most important carbon fuel, oil, translates into the same prices that kill economic growth and hence the demand for oil. Conventional oil, cheap oil, peaked around 2005. Now, today, you hear that the world's awash with oil. It is, but it's not awash with cheap oil. It's awash with very expensive oil. All of the increases in oil supply have not come out of OPEC. They've come right here. When I say here, of course, I mean North America. I mean, 5 million barrels a day that wasn't flowing 4 to 5 years ago from places like Eagle Ford in the Permian Basin in Texas, from the Bakken in North Dakota. These are fracked shale formations. And of course, about another million and a half barrels of heavy oil that flows out of the Canadian oil sands. Now, it wasn't too long ago that this increase was championed and heralded as the days of energy independence, that we would no longer be dependent on big bad Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who expropriated Exxon, or dependent on the hostile and volatile Middle East, that we would become energy self-sufficient. What was not pointed out by the Report on Business or the Wall Street Journal, who were heralding these increases, was that while they were the basis for energy independence, they were predicated on very high oil prices. And the reason that they were predicated on very high oil prices is because they were some of the most costly oil to produce in the world. None more so at the apex of the global cost curve than the Canadian oil sands. So the paradox is that the kind of oil prices that are needed to raise oil from deep water wells miles below the ocean floor, or to get a barrel of oil out of 2 tons of bitumen, or a barrel of oil out of fracking shale formations, translates into the same prices that kill economic growth. And indeed, in the almost decade experience that we've had with these prices, we've not only seen the deepest recession in the post-war period, the Great Recession, but the most anemic economic recovery thereafter. If that's not a formidable challenge enough, and it is a formidable challenge right now because oil prices are below the cost of production in the Canadian oil sands and in a good part of the shale oil that's flowing from places like the Bakken and Eagle Ford, there's an even more formidable obstacle in the future, and that's the environmental constraint. For some time now, the world scientific community has been telling us that we cannot use the atmosphere as a garbage dump for carbon emissions. We've already hit over 400 parts per million carbon. And if we're going to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, if we're going to stabilize the global average at 2 degrees Celsius warming, then in fact, we're going to have to be consuming less, not more, carbon fuels in the future. The International Energy Agency, which is probably the world's most authoritative body on energy consumption and supply, took the heatings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and modeled just what would a 450 part per million world imply about future fossil fuel usage, not in the far distant future, but in the next 2 decades. And of course, it's a very different demand profile than you would see in the business plans of Peabody Energy or Arch Coal or Suncor or Exxon, which would basically tell you that it's going to be business as usual. And if the global economy is going to grow, then we're going to continue to see very substantial increases in fossil fuel usage. Instead, what we find is that world coal consumption would have to fall by about 1/3 in the next 2 decades, and that world oil consumption will peak in the next 4 to 5 years and then decline by about 15%. Well, what does that imply about oil prices, and what does that imply about who gets to produce oil and who doesn't get to produce oil? In the 2008-09 recession, a period in which oil prices fell from about $147 a barrel to about $40 a barrel, there was a 3.5% decline in world oil consumption. What we're talking about is one that's about 5 times as great. and one of which, of course, there can be no recovery. In that world, it's not Saudi Arabia who shuts in production. In that world, it's the high-cost producer who shuts in production. In fact, even in today's world, it's the high-cost producer that must shut in production. And the highest cost producer is the Canadian oil sands. Instead of going from 2 million barrels a day to 5 million barrels a day, as the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers is forecasting, at today's oil prices, let alone tomorrow's oil prices, it's far from clear whether even the 2 million barrels a day is sustainable, which raises an interesting question. And the interesting question is, how do you shut in production in the oil sands? What does it cost to decommission an oil sands mine? And perhaps most fundamentally, who will pay those costs? But perhaps that's a conversation for another day. The oil sands is not the only source of emissions in Canada, and it is a source of emissions that is not mobile since it can't move. But of course, the task of decarbonizing our economy doesn't just rest with what happens to the oil sands. It rests with, are we going to be successful in putting a price on carbon emissions? And on that score, let me just step back and say that as an economist, I've always been taught that there's some fundamental trade-off between doing what's right for the environment and doing what's right for the economy. That if we were going to show environmental stewardship, that it would cost us in job creation and growth. And that's a trade-off that we'd invariably have to make. But when we recognize that there's a constraint on what we can emit, there's really only two choices. It's don't grow or grow green. In other words, the only way to grow is going to be if emissions per unit of GDP fall at least the rate of growing. And that's a very different paradigm than the paradigm that we've all been schooled in. Well, how do we get the economy to decarbonize? How do we get emissions per unit of GDP to decline steadily over time if there is no price to emissions? And the market failure here is not really a market failure because government has not put a context out there in which the market can operate. And the context must be that carbon pollution carries a price and that polluters must pay that price. And if they do, then I think the market can respond in ways that are very positive to the decarbonization of our economy. But how do we put a price on carbon emissions? In Canada, there is a hodgepodge of different federal regulations, starting with real action, like the BC $30 a ton carbon price, to opportunistic cash grabs, like Quebec and Ontario's cap and trade, to outright farce, like Alberta's special emitters legislation, to nothing, as is the case of many provinces. So you can understand that when people like Justin Trudeau and Thomas Mulcair want to defer to the provinces, I'm somewhat skeptical with that, and certainly don't see that as a strong testament to national leadership. What's wrong with cap and trade? Well, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with cap and trade. Cap and trade was used quite successfully in the 1980s against SO2 and NOx, the gases that were related to acid rain, and in fact spearheaded very significant reductions by North American emissions. But cap and trade in the context of carbon has been, shall we say, bastardized to the point where one wonders what the real objectives here are. If $15 a ton, which is the price of emissions that is expected to come out of the Ontario system that will be plugged into the Quebec system and the California system, if that was the end point, I could certainly hold my nose to whatever objections I might have. And I guess my principal objection here in Ontario is that while it's not called a tax increase, it's a $2 to $3 billion tax increase by any other name. Now, if Kathleen Wynne was here, she'd say, yeah, but I'm going to use the bulk of that $2 to $3 billion to finance public transit. And I think most people in this room would agree that getting people to use public transit instead of driving their own vehicles is a step in the right direction in terms of carbon emissions. But is $15 a starting point, or is $15 an ending point? I think we all recognize, even the BC tax that was originally supposed to be escalated every year, that $15, that even $30 a ton is an entry point, not an end point. The kind of prices that we're ultimately going to need to put on carbon emissions to take the economy where it has to go, to allow our economy to grow and provide income and employment with at the same time reducing carbon emissions, is going to result in prices of $50 to $100 a ton. Well, what are the fiscal implications of that? We're not talking $2 to $3 billion anymore. We're talking 8, 10, 12, 15 billion dollars. And you know what? If you subject the economy, provincial economy, to that kind of a fiscal shock, Stephen Harper's right. That is a job killer. That is an economy killer. And there's going to be pushback, and there's going to be tax revolt. You see, decarbonizing our economy doesn't mean increasing taxes. Decarbonizing our economy means shifting that tax base from income to carbon. We're not talking about alcohol and cigarettes, okay? We're not talking about little niche products in the economy that you can tax the shit of, okay? We're talking about something that is pervasive throughout the economy. That's why the beauty of it is for people who want to raise revenues, that you can put a really low price on carbon, like $15 a ton, 2 cents a liter, and still raise $2-3 billion because the carbon base is so pervasive. If we're going to get to the kind of carbon prices that get real traction in terms of business behavior, in terms of consumer behavior, the kind of revenues that would flow from that are in the billions and billions. And if they're not offset by reductions in other taxes, it's not going to be economically sustainable. That's what I like about the British Columbia model. That, you know, it's not a job killer, it's a job creator. Because if you do what it intends, and it adds about 7 cents a liter at the pump, you end up spending less money at the pumps. But because you've got a cut in your personal income taxes, you have the disposable income to spend more money on everything else. And as I say, that's a source of economic stimulus, not a job killer. I would like to think that BC's standard of $30 a ton should be at a minimum the national standard. And when BC is asked, why have you not increased the carbon tax as was originally intended, the typical answer is, well, we're still waiting for the rest of the country to catch up. You see, what we really need here is a national standard. We need a national standard because if we don't have a national standard, then mobile emissions, and most emissions are mobile, will arbitrage the different regulatory bodies, and emissions will travel to the lowest common denominator. So that all we'll end up doing is redistributing emissions from provinces that put a meaningful price on carbon to provinces that don't. Now, we could have a federal carbon tax that works in conjunction with existing provincial legislation. For example, if the national carbon tax was $30, then the federal carbon tax in BC could be zero because BC already has a $30 tax. And in Ontario and Quebec, if cap and trade is $15 a ton, then the national carbon tax would bring that up to $30 a ton. But the point is that we would have a uniform pricing of carbon across the country. And the point is that the billions of dollars that are raised through carbon taxation would be offset by cuts in personal income tax, because what we're talking about is not increasing the tax burden. What we're talking about is shifting the tax burden to a carbon base. Now, there's a second problem that I have with cap and trade. Again, nothing intrinsic to the notion of cap and trade, but the way that it's been implemented in places like California and Quebec, and invariably in Ontario. And that is that, perversely, we find that some of the largest industrial emitters in these jurisdictions are exempted from cap and trade. Or they're not exempted, they're given free emission credits, which by any other name is an exemption. In California, the list is perverse, starting with oil and gas, steel, chemical, pulp and paper, cement. When we go to Quebec, its 2 oil refineries are exempt, its aluminum smelters are exempt. I mean, these are the largest emitters. It's like, Alberta does the same, but exempts the oil sands, okay? And invariably, when Kathleen Wynne unveils her cap and trade, auto assembly and a host of other favored industries will be exempt. Why is it that certain industries should be exempt and others not? Well, I guess it's the same question as, why did the Ontario taxpayer cough out billions of dollars to bail out the auto industry, but not other manufacturing industries that shed 500,000 jobs? What makes a job in one industry so intrinsically more valuable than another is a question that I think is worth asking. But, invariably what will be said is that these industries are exempt either because they're strategically important for whatever jurisdiction it is, or because if we did that, they would simply pack up and go to another jurisdiction, and that we would lose the job and income, but there wouldn't be any ultimate environmental benefit because they just emit somewhere else. First let me point out that when you make certain industries play by one set of rules and another industry play by another set of rules, enhancing competitiveness is the last thing that you get. What you get is economic distortions and a misallocation of capital. But would it not be better, instead of governments cherry picking which local industries they're going to exempt, to rather make everybody play by the same rules? And when I say everybody play by the same rules, I mean all those people who wish to sell into our market who produce elsewhere. That if you're going to sell into the Canadian economy and we make our producers pay a $30 ton price on their emissions, then you should have to pay $30 a ton on your emissions. That carbon pollution is an unfair trade subsidy and must be countervailed by a tariff. And that's particularly important in an economy like Canada, which is so open, where 30 to 40% of our GDP is exports and imports. Now, what about exports? Well, the one thing that I do like about the cap and trade system, particularly between California and Quebec, is it's cross-border. And it establishes a cross-border norm for carbon pricing. Let's take that one step further. let's negotiate trade agreements with our major trading partners like the United States that determine a uniform price for carbon emissions, of which can serve as a basis for a tariff against all imports coming through. And we may find that in the end, the trade system is a very powerful tool to get carbon pricing, particularly in economies like Canada that are so open. So I guess to sum up, I think that it's great that we're moving towards recognizing a need to put a price on carbon. If, as I say, $15 was an end point, my criticisms of what's going on in Quebec and Ontario would be of secondary notion. But what I'm trying to say is this is an inappropriate instrument. This is an inappropriate fiscal architecture to base the decarbonization of our economies. Because to get to the kind of carbon prices that we'll need to get, the fiscal revenues will be colossal, and if not offset, will fulfill how they're being characterized by the harshest critics of carbon prices. So something to recognize. I don't think we can just leave it to the provinces. I think that we need a national standard. I think that national standard should be able to work in conjunction, whatever there is in a particular province. But we need to put a price on carbon. We need to put a price on carbon now. And we need to make sure that everybody, every industry, every province, every good, no matter where it's manufactured, if it's sold in Canada, plays by the same rules. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. You did not disappoint. I usually find economics real boring and I phase out, and I was with you the whole time. That was amazing. Thank you so much. 7:02. Okay, we have about 18 minutes for questions, and I'm gonna muster up my best Jerry LaBelle. Jerry usually moderates for us, so make sure you ask a question or I'm gonna cut you off. That's what he does, okay? So please, to the floor, please ask a question and come. I'm gonna need you on microphone. Cheryl? Yeah, let's just do it on TV for.
Oh, okay. Hi. Thank you, Jeff. That was amazing. That was really very, very interesting. So a lot of us here are going to be lobbying our MPPs tomorrow. And we recognize our favorite mechanism is a rising fee on carbon, right at the point of when it comes out of the ground or enters the market, and giving the money back to the people, as you had mentioned. But we understand that Ontario is marching forward on cap and trade. So we're going to lobby for the most efficient cap and trade system. One of the things that we say is as upstream as possible. And I'm hearing varying opinions on that it's actually not possible to put a cap right when it comes out of the ground or when it enters the market. And maybe if you can maybe comment on that.
Well, by all means, I mean, we've got to tax emissions where they are created. But in the case of oil, let's recognize that the bulk of emissions is when you turn over your ignition key. So, it's got to be at the pumps. I'm arguing that if you can't feel it, it ain't working, okay? I mean, the whole idea is to induce changes in economic behavior. The whole idea is for you to consume less oil. And while certainly we have to tax emissions from the extraction of oil, we have to tax emissions from the combustion of oil. And that means at the pumps. And again, BC, 7 cents. Guess what? BC's gasoline consumption has fallen compared to every other province where it's grown. That's not an accident. That's what a 7 cent a liter gasoline tax will do. And that's what we need. Now, for that to be economically recycled, we've got to find a way of putting that money back in people's pockets, but not so that they can fill up so they can spend it on other things. So we need downstream, we need upstream, but it's just not going to be Suncor. I mean, Suncor doesn't drive the cars. We drive the cars. So by all means, Suncor's got to pay the cost of emissions from extraction, but we, the consumer, have to recognize that just like the price of cigarettes doesn't depend on the cost of tobacco or the price of rum on the cost of sugarcane, that when we fill up our tanks and we turn over the engine, it's just not the cost of extracting the oil, it's also the cost of combusting the oil.
Go ahead, Tom.
Thanks, Jeff. On the border adjustments issue, so you mentioned both on incoming as well as outgoing goods, you'd arrange a mechanism. Can you elaborate a little bit about that? And is there anything intrinsically easier in terms of cap and trade versus fee and dividend or carbon tax mechanisms in terms of border adjustments?
I mean, carbon tax is much more transparent. Cap and trade is much more bureaucratic and cumbersome, but these would be second or third order considerations to my criticism, which is this, that we're going to be talking about HST type revenues if we get serious about a real price on carbon, and that has huge economic consequences if we're not going to offset that. As far as a carbon tariff, I mean, there's a long history in North America of using tariffs to countervail unfair trade subsidies. I think we got to recognize that in a world that desperately needs to decarbonize, carbon pollution is an unfair trade subsidy. That when certain countries are going to spend billions and billions of dollars decarbonizing, we're not just simply going to let those industries absorb those costs and allow their competitors to play by another set of rules, because that's not sustainable. Now, I raised the question of exports because that's a little bit more problematic than imports. I mean, imports, we can have a carbon tariff and we can impose that tariff on imports that don't pay for their carbon emissions. But what about carbon exports? What about exports? Canada's, exports are like 30-35% of GDP in a country like Canada. How do we compete in third markets, in export markets, against competitors who don't ask their manufacturers to pay for carbon emissions? And that's why we need trade treaties that recognize carbon. And that's the one real positive thing I see about the Quebec California thing is here you have a cross-border arrangement between our major trading partner, by the way, the United States, that has a uniform price for carbon. Well, that could be a model for a Canada, US, maybe Mexico in time, others, bilateral, multilateral trade agreement where we have one carbon price, and that goes a long way in allaying the concerns that exporters might have about competing, in a world in which they're asked to pay for their carbon emissions, but others are not.
Yes.
Yes, thanks very much for that, Jeff. I have a question for you regarding the just a general tax, the tax on carbon you're referring to, whether it's a straight tax or carbon trade. Do you think it's the magic bullet that's going to solve the climate crisis? And if not, why not? In terms of your background in economics and, very prominent people like Mark Carney, for instance, recently coming out and saying very, very strong things about the consequences. Well, the fact that he's saying them now with the Bank of England is quite significant. One would say it goes into the same category as the comments from the Pope, I would say, So what would you think about that? Is it the magic bullet?
I mean, I'm an economist. So prices are my religion, okay? In other words, I think that prices go a long way in explaining what we do and what we don't do. Okay. And I think that what has been lacking here is pricing the full cost of what's happening. In economics, you call that an externality. That carbon emissions, our singular reliance on fossil fuels is now having environmental effects that in turn are going to have huge, huge economic costs that are not being priced in to the economic practices that we're sustaining. So I guess, yes, I'm a believer in carbon taxes, but prices at what level? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Even BC's $30 a ton level is an entry point, not a final point. And let's recognize that the kind of prices that we're ultimately going to need, and when I say need, allow this economy or any economy to grow while at the same time reducing emissions, is going to require prices a multiple of that. And that's why I argue that, we're going to have to rechannel these revenues, or they're going to become economically suffocating, and there's for sure going to lead to a tax revolt backlash. Okay, so that's why I don't think that cap and trade is the appropriate system, because at $50, $60 a ton, we're going to find a way of recycling this money. So yeah, now getting back to what Governor Carney said, I guess the transatlantic flight changed his perception. I remember Governor Carney in the Dutch disease debate saying that the oil sands were unambiguously good for the Canadian economy, but I guess he's had a second perspective on this. His point is valid enough. His point is that these fossil fuel reserves may not be what capital markets have valued, that these fossil fuel reserves may be stranded assets. And in fact, when you look at, what would be required to stabilize atmospheric carbon at 450 parts per million, something between 2/3 to 3/4 of all the P1 reserves of nat gas, coal and oil cannot be combusted, which raises the question, why are these companies spending $700 billion finding more? That's a question that their shareholders and they are no doubt discussing. But, whatever the stranded assets of hydrocarbon reserves in the North Sea, which I presume Governor Carney was referring to, they pale compared to the 170 billion tons of oil in the Alberta oil sands, which according to the International Energy Agency is the third largest oil reserve in the country. So whatever the consequences that they may have for the UK, multiply that by a scalar here in Canada, because as I was going to say at the beginning of my remarks, Canada was very much at the periphery of the dot-com bubble and the subprime mortgage bubble. We are at the epicenter of the carbon bubble. Not that the carbon bubble isn't a global phenomena, it is, but I can think of no other country that has sort of bet its economic future on a fossil fuel that is probably the most vulnerable of any, or certainly as vulnerable as any as coal, to a world of restricted emissions.
One more question. Richard caught my eye, sorry, to everybody else.
Thank you very much, Jeff. One of the questions that is frequently asked is, what countries do we have as a reference point that have done this well? We've got BC here locally, but in the international realm, who's done this well and who's got the border adjustments right? And we've had lots of discussions earlier today about border adjustments, and they seem to be pretty complex. So,
yeah. Well, a country like Sweden comes to mind. A country like Denmark comes to mind. But it's also important to recognize that natural endowments go a long way in determining who's green and who's not green. Okay, like if if Denmark had the oil sands, would they really be pioneers in wind energy? Okay, if would Alberta be the same if they didn't have the oil sands? So without getting too sanctimonious, there's usually an economic context for countries' policies. And you're going to find that the countries that have been the most aggressive, there are reasons for that. But, in Norway's case, I think it's particularly interesting because Norway is a fossil fuel producer. Now, it's not a high-cost fossil fuel producer like the oil sands. The one thing that really stands out about Norway, and something that Albertans should recognize, is that Norway set up its endowment fund about 10 years after the oil sands. Alberta did. It has about $1 trillion. Alberta has about 17 billion. Even East Timor has more than Alberta. So have Albertans made the right choice? I guess they've consumed it in different ways. The reason there's no provincial sales tax is part of that explanation. The reason why they had a 10% flat tax, personal income tax, I guess, is part of the explanation. But when future Albertans look back at what they've gotten from this resource compared to Norwegians, compared to Alaskans or even East Timorians, they may have reason to question the model. No oil jurisdiction that I can think of has kept so little out of what they have produced than Alberta. One of the countries that have the lowest oil royalty rates in the world. That's a question for Albertans to look at. When Jim Prentice told them to look in the mirror, you know what? It probably wasn't the right thing for him to say, but was the right thing for him to say. For 40 years, that's the choice Albertans made. I think they're going to have reason to second guess those choices. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. I would love for us to get a group photo with you. Is that okay? So we have to do this really smoothly. And thank you so much. You did not disappoint. This was amazing. This was perfect. So we'll line up here. Yeah, can you lobby with us tomorrow? No, we're kidding. Okay. Yeah, that's it. That's a great idea. Okay, so can you come around this way, Betty? And everybody's just going to stand up where they are.
Where do you want me?
Right here. And we have two, keep calm and price carbon. And can you shut off the audio, please, so I don't get feedback? So we'll just give everyone a minute to settle. Thanks everyone for coming into that picture. A picture says 1,000 words. So we'll just wait for people to come back. Does anybody have a booklet on them? Yeah, just one. Oh, we have 3 minutes. We're ahead of time. That is great. So we have 3 minutes. I don't want to mutilate your name. I'm saying it right, right?
Tom Chervinsky.
Oh, got it. Okay, good. I knew I had it.
I've been living with this name. It's fine.
I have a really easy name, except everybody spells it wrong. But
Really?
well, there's no K in Italian.
Right.
Right. There's no K in Italian. Cathy with a K.
I thought most Catholics were racist.
No, a lot of British ones aren't. Okay. I'm a Cathy with a C. 1 minute, everyone. We're actually on time. This is really good. So we have speaker. Okay, so I am happy to introduce our guest speaker tonight. It's Tom Chervinsky. His talk is Getting Past Partisanship, Building Support Across Party Lines. Tom Chervinsky is the Vice President, Campaigns of Canadians for Clean Prosperity, specializing in political engagement, marketing, and strategy. He holds degrees in business and social psychology. Born in Toronto, Tom started his career working for members of parliament in Ottawa, managing communications, policy, and critic portfolios, including Labour and the Treasury Board. Since then, he has worked for a variety of organizations where he played the key leadership role in political and advocacy campaigns. Responsible for shaping Canadians for Clean Prosperity's campaigns and political engagement strategies, Tom is always interested in new ways to engage and motivate Canadians to build public and political support for a stronger, cleaner economy. When he's not tackling pollution, Tom can be seen on the field tackling opponents as an amateur rugby player. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Cathy. All right, I'm going to set down the water here and hope I'm okay and try not to move around because Yannick's having a tough enough time. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really wonderful and inspiring to see you guys digging in and getting deeply involved with our democracy. And the work that CCL does really is incredible and very, very rare to see citizens really digging in to democratic engagement more than just showing up at the polls. And even then, not most, but a large number of our fellow citizens aren't going to vote. And that's a really, really powerful thought for two reasons. One is it's very sad because a lot of people's voices get lost. The other effect is that the people who do vote, their voices are magnified. They're much more important. So the people who show up, who show up to vote, and the people who show up tomorrow to go lobby, your voices are much louder than your average citizens. And that's a really powerful thing. And I commend you for digging into your democratic opportunities and responsibilities. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit about getting past partisanship. And in particular, I want to make an assumption here. and I'll judge based on the way heads nod. Is it safe to assume that most people in this room would consider themselves to be progressives? Is it safe to are any of you members of the Conservative Party or Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario? Wonderful, wonderful. For the leadership. No, that's really something that whoever. So what's really important is to think about that for a minute, because when you're going to speak with conservatives tomorrow, and I take it that there are progressive conservatives that you're meeting with, they know that too. They're coming into this meeting saying, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to sit down with a bunch of progressives who don't understand the way I view the world, don't understand my constituents, don't understand my values, and I'm going to listen, and I'm going to try and be respectful, and you'll find that most of them are very nice, very respectful, but what I think is really interesting is they'll likely have some very tough questions that might come from a different set of priorities than the ones you're bringing forward. So I want to start for a second by telling you a little bit about what Canadians for Clean Prosperity does, so you know where I'm coming from. Canadians for Clean Prosperity is an organization that's dedicated to finding market-based solutions to environmental challenges. And what that really means, decoded, is we work a lot with conservatives and conservative thinkers. We think about how the economy can be used to price pollution instead of heavy government regulation, instead of big government spending. A lot of what Jeff was saying a few minutes ago are the things that we're saying as well. We are deeply terrified of an economy that takes billions and billions of dollars out of the pockets of everyday families to fund big government priorities. But we're also deeply afraid of a world where we don't tackle climate change. And so we need a solution that deals with both. And to date, we've ended up with a problem from our perspective where inordinately on the left, we have solutions that deal with the real challenges of climate change, but don't embrace the economic challenges that come with that. And inordinately on the right, we've had solutions of, well, we haven't seen a lot of solutions for the past few years from the right on climate change. And that's something that has to change. So I want to talk a little bit about the conservative base. And I know it's in the booklet. I don't know if you guys got a chance to look at some of the polling numbers, but the reason I mention it's in the booklet is it's there for you to refer to later. So don't rush to jot. So when they did a poll recently, an important big national poll called Focus Canada by Environics, when asked, is global warming real and is it mostly caused by people? 61% of Canadians and 61% of Ontarians said yes. Only 43% of people who identified as conservative supporters did. That's almost 20% less. That's a huge difference in worldview and in outlook. When asked if they're concerned about climate change, half of Canadians and 53% of Ontarians said yes. Only 32% of people who identify as conservatives said they were concerned about climate change. And so when conservatives get elected, they're coming with this viewpoint and with that social circle and with that sphere. So when they think about the critical issues to deal with, that's the viewpoint they're bringing. In terms of support for the BC system, which is something that Clean Prosperity supports very strongly, and I know CCL supports very, very similar system, most Canadians and Ontarians agree. It's 58% in Canada and in Ontario, only 42% when they've had the system explained to them. If they're conservatives, it's only 42% that'll support. So I want to take it one step further though. When asked, is it possible to shift energy requirements from fossil fuels to renewables? 74% of Canadians said it was possible. Only 56% of conservatives even believe we can get off fossil fuels. And you have to understand that worldview if you're going to go and speak with them, right? There's a real reality there. But there's an opportunity there as well, because we are blessed to live in a democracy, and in order to form a government, you need to convince more people than maybe your party base in order to win an election. And so it's important for parties to reach beyond those base emotions, and they know that. And the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario right now is going through a period of deep introspection and deep change. It's been a very difficult time to be a conservative in Ontario, especially now with the way the polling numbers are looking federally as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the mindset that might make sense as you're going and speaking with them, and some thoughts about language. So I want to start with something. How many of you guys use the phrase carbon pollution? By a show of hands, have said the phrase carbon pollution. I know this seems trivial, and it's something I had to learn. For a lot of conservatives, that specific phrase rubs them the wrong way. Even conservatives who are passionate about tackling climate change will say it's carbon emissions, but it's different than pollution. It's not the same kind of challenge. And when you lump it in like that, you're oversimplifying, and they shut down. So I'd encourage you to use the phrase carbon emissions when you're talking to progressive conservatives. From the conservatives' point of view, I know one of the core tenets of Citizens Climate Lobby is to listen. And one of the things that if you listen to conservatives, both the citizens and the elected officials, that they'll say their number one issue is, it's energy prices. That is their issue. That is their concern. And it's easy for us to say, well, yeah, but take a minute and think about that. What they're really saying is it's not just energy prices, it's the effect of energy prices, not just on the economy and on manufacturing and on the jobs base of this province, but what they're worried about is how are their constituents going to heat their houses. Conservatives predominantly in this province come from more rural parts of the country, of the province, a lot of them in northern Ontario, and it costs money to heat a home in the winter. And the more that costs, the harder life is for their citizens. So it's really important to consider that and to think about that. And that's something you're going to hear from them tomorrow if you're meeting with conservatives. And it's important to think about how you're going to answer that. Because fixing climate change is important, but so is making sure that their constituents can pay their bills. And that's where how revenue gets recycled is so important. Another thing to think about is Ontario's economy. And so I want to talk for a second about Ontario's Chamber of Commerce, which is a big umbrella group that houses most of Ontario's businesses. And they've every time they put out a report now, it starts with a preamble. And it says, this specific initiative that the government wants to do, including when they put out their recent report on climate change, interesting, good idea, except for you're doing everything right now to us, and there's no way we can compete like this. So what they're saying, what conservatives will repeat to you, I think, tomorrow, and what you need to be ready for, is why this and why right now. Because what they're hearing is, okay, the government's going to bring in a retirement pension plan, they're raising taxes, the energy prices are through the roof, and now they're going to call it a tax on everything. And how is Ontario to compete with Michigan, who doesn't have any of those things? How are they going to keep the jobs here? How are they going to keep Ford here? And that's where the conversation needs to start. So if I'm in your shoes, and when I am in your shoes, when I do meet with conservatives, I would think about that as a moment of opportunity to say, you're right. You're absolutely right. That's a concern. So how do we build a strong economy, one that lowers taxes, that keeps government small, that keeps business nimble? It's by lowering taxes. And the way we do that is we take the revenue from a carbon fee and we recycle that back to families. So and there's something for CCL to think about in terms of how much of the current system that's being discussed by CCL in terms of the dividend, how does that work for businesses? And how do we find a way to make sure that businesses also stay competitive? And it's not just money going back to families, but there's a legitimate concern from Ontario's business sector, and all elected officials are hearing that right now. And the last thing I want to say is don't overstate and don't tokenize the support from conservatives that are out there. Bob Inglis is wonderful. For those of you who've heard of him, he's incredible. He's a Republican from the States who has been fighting to price carbon for a very long time. And he's very inspirational and he's great. But when you hold up one person and say, well, but there's this guy, there's this messiah out there, and he's wonderful, and he's perfect, and you guys should all be like him, it rings false to them. So instead of holding up tokens, I'd encourage you to look into other conservatives around the world and conservative groups and how they're tackling this, because the conservatives need an answer on this. And so with this, I want to bring it back to where I started, and I'll wrap up with this. In order to win, politicians need to convince Ontarians to vote for them. Most Ontarians and Canadians want action on this file. Is it their number one issue? Probably not. But they want action. This is an important issue. And so Conservatives know they need a policy on this area. They need a credible, real approach to climate change. And that's what you have to give them. You have a good, strong, solid, economically sound approach to dealing with climate change. And so that's what you're there to share with them, I think, tomorrow. And to offer to them to take on the mantle of, say, you don't need Kathleen Wynne, Premier Wynne's strategy. Here's a better one. And it's conservative and it's sound. And that's how they're thinking about the world. So that is, that's a strategy that can work with some Conservatives. I want to end with a quote. We had an event about a week ago with Vic Fideli, who ran for the leadership of the Ontario PCs. He's held important economic and energy files for them for a long time now. And what he said was, Conservatives need to get their oars in the water on this. This is a policy area that Conservatives need to get involved with, and they know it. And now they're trying to figure out how, and they're looking for a politically and economically viable policy. So that's something that you can offer. With that, I want to take questions, and I want to really applaud you for everything you guys are doing. I know it's hard sometimes to take the day off, to put this above everything else, and it's really, really incredible and wonderful to see a room of people who are really engaging in that. So I want to thank you guys for that.
Thank you. I learned lots, and that is really helping for us tomorrow. Thank you. So I'd like to take some questions from the floor. Somebody who hasn't asked a question first. Oh, there you go. Go ahead.
Thanks for coming and speaking with us tonight. I'm a big fan of the BC carbon tax as well, but I am troubled that it's stuck at $30 a ton. What do you feel, from your perspective, a reasonable ceiling for that? And do you have any problems with cutting in income tax, that's the model they followed, down to zero, and then going negative?
I think it's an interesting idea. Where we're at with that is we've actually submitted a document to British Columbia's government advocating that they begin raising their fees again, that they make sure that what they do with that money is broad-based tax cuts, not niche tax cuts for things like the film sector or those kinds of things, because we believe that those are economically stronger. In terms of getting to whether there should be a negative income tax, I think it's an interesting idea. I don't think that there's a reason to debate that yet. Let's get to zero, and then we can figure out what we do with the rest of the money. But absolutely, I think that there's merit in that from everything I've read, but I'm also not an economist, so.
Question? Yeah, Richard.
Tom, thank you very much for the presentation. Of all the, and you made a number of very insightful remarks, probably the one that caused me the most pause was the comment about businesses not seeing anything back if we just hand all the money back to the individual citizens, and that businesses are going to sort of stand up and oppose this. I guess double-barrel question. First, do you have a good solution from a clean prosperity perspective to that? And secondly, what jurisdictions or what conservative commentators have sort of got behind this? So, you know, that we have other blue chip reference points in conservative space.
Thanks, Richard. So in terms of other conservatives that have gotten on board with this, there's a long list of conservatives and growing list coming out of the United States right now. There is Art Laffer, and who was one of the senior Republican economic advisors And he's actually a famous economist. He came up with what's called the Laffer curve. And so people who are involved in economics and business will know him. And he's been very strong on a shift of taxes from income to pollution taxes. In Canada, you're starting to see some really interesting things and some very interesting voices coming forward. It's absolutely fascinating that Jim Prentice was starting to move, and he was serious. Jim Prentice was absolutely serious about tackling climate change, and whatever it is that people think about him and how he lost the election and all those things, he absolutely is an example of a conservative who believes in climate change, believes something needed to be done, and was working towards action on that. Fast enough or not, those are things up for debate. Monty Solberg is another example. He's a former minister. He's not loud. He's not screaming from the rooftops. There's a reason for that. Conservatives who support this policy, these kinds of policies, are really, they might support it, but they're also not looking to pick a fight with their friends. And I mean that genuinely. For those of you who've been involved in politics, you know that your political circle is also your social circle, and you care deeply about these people. There is no question that no matter how much a conservative believes in cap and trade or fee and dividend or the BC model or any of these other models, what they want to see on October 19th is a strong, secure majority Stephen Harper government. That's what they believe in, and that's what they're looking for. They're emotionally invested. That's their friends, that's their family, and there is that mindset. So you're not going to see people right now standing up and screaming. But what gets interesting is we were at the Manning Center Conference. That's the last name I'd give you, is Preston Manning. He's been very strong leader on this. We always go to the Manning Center Conference, and we set up a booth last year. And I think we had one of the most signed up for email lists out of all the groups there, which was really fascinating because so few people wanted to be at our booth during the public grazing time. People came to us in between during the sessions when no one else was there and said, thank you so much. This is great. You're right. This is so interesting. How's this going in BC? What are people saying? And some of them would challenge us, and some of them had very tough questions. Some of them sent us back and made us have to go back and look at what we were proposing very closely because in some instances their questions were right. In terms of our solution, I'll start with our next best option is the fee and dividend model. We feel very close to CCL's model. We build ourselves almost entirely on the BC model. BC lowered corporate taxes quite significantly as well as lowering income taxes quite significantly. Our response to a lot of groups, and especially on cap and trade, is why are we doubling down on a system that hasn't worked anywhere fully yet when BC's working? And we know it works, and it's easy to put into practice. So we're really just copy and paste. And that's really where we're at as an organization. And then it's about deciding how much each of these taxes get cut. But that's what we would say is our next best, but I don't know what CCL's answer to that is.
Citizens Climate Lobby likes to give all the money back to households for a couple of reasons. We're concerned about cap and trade because it's easy to game. If you decide to give part of the money to corporations, it's going to be very easy to game, I think. You know, there's going to be lobby issues. But also, if you put a rising fee and it goes high, it goes really, really high, that money, especially if it's at the wellhead or the point it enters the market, that will be passed on from the producer of the oil, the fossil fuel, down to businesses, to industries that will pass their cost down to the consumer in the end. So, and yes, you can argue that businesses are consumers as well, but it really is an incentive for businesses to reduce emissions. So,
I think the only other thing I'd say is, if that's where your conversation is, then the answer is there are ways to make life better for businesses in Ontario. And it's not, let's not get caught up in that because there's ways to spend the revenue in different ways. We can look at that, but don't throw out the baby with the bathwater because, you know, pricing is good, it's efficient. It's what every economist tells us we should be doing, so why aren't we? The last conservative group, or not conservative, but economic group, is the Eco-Fiscal Commission, which does amazing work, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the stuff they're doing. Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. Yannick wants your voice for the video.
Okay. You're, by the sounds of it, an expert on the BC system. I'm not. But I am at a bit of a loss to understand how, for the individual consumer, it's going to change behavior if, as an example, my family has to pay 7 cents more a gallon, or a liter for gasoline, and we need to drive to boot. And I'm going to get it back through some other tax reduction. At the end of the month, the family budget's more or less the same. So how's that going to cause me to buy a smaller car, to drive less? Oh, and one other comment. Jeff said that gasoline consumption is down. I'm wondering, is that the reason? He didn't say how much it's down. What are the reasons why? Other reasons why it might be down?
17%.
Yeah, so, and it depends on which model you're subtracting from. And so that gets a little complicated in BC, but estimates are anywhere between 16 and 19%. If 17% is the number that CCL is going with, then that's the one everyone should probably use over the 5-year period. Yeah, so now one more year in and they're starting to say 19. What gets interesting is the BC model, the whole concept of pricing, from what economists tell me, because remember, I've got the business degree, but it's, I was studying from a textbook. I'm not a PhD or anywhere near that. The idea is that your family will choose to spend the money they get back, whether it's from a dividend or from an income tax cut, in the way that makes the most sense for them. So by pricing this stuff and giving them the money back, they can then decide, okay, well, instead of driving the car that I'm driving for an extra 7 cents a gallon, maybe it makes sense to buy a more fuel efficient car, save the money and use that to go to Florida for the holidays, right? Economists tell us that when we raise the prices on things, people will start to make those shifts. And in BC, that 17% reduction is very much being credited to the price that they've put in place. It's the fundamental building block that all of these policies are built on. The idea that if you charge people for something, they will want to do it less. And then what we're saying is we have to give them the money back so that they can make investments in other areas of the economy and of their lives. But if we just regulate and say you can't drive, that's just a non-starter, I think, in Canada. So I don't know what the alternative really could be.
Just to add to it, it's really important to for the price to rise. So it's going to rise over time, so that when you're at a point when you're ready to buy that car, you're going to want to buy a fuel-efficient car. And there's anecdotal evidence in British Columbia. Shih-Ling Su, who is an economist who wrote the case for the carbon tax, he and his family were doing a reno on their house, and they wanted to do an extension. The contractor told him, while you're doing it, you should make it really energy efficient, and here's how you do it. And of course, Shih-Ling Su, who was helping with the carbon tax, says, "How do you know this?" And he says, "Oh, it's the BC carbon tax. Clients tell me this. They're concerned about this. When they know that fuel price is going to go higher and higher and higher over the years, at the point that's what they thought was going to happen. That's going to send a signal. Oh boy, I better start to make my house more efficient. I better get a better fuel efficient car. I like to invest in a Prius. Whatever it is."
Thank you, Tom. This was extremely insightful. I just wanted to point out to everybody those cookies that were for dinner are very popular in Paris. Get it? Paris? Okay. And it's a Keep Calm and Price Carbon t-shirt.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yay. Okay. Thank you, Tom. Did you want me to make the announcement?
Made a contribution of their lifetime, we have a roll out here, and everything that you donate will go to the work of Citizens Climate Lobby.
Oh, bless you. Thank you. Thank you. And I'd like to get a few pictures with Tom up here. Whoever wants, please come. Let's get some with this great light on us.
Yannick, what's my good light? Where's that slimming lens?
Can you turn off the mic, please?
Yeah, where do you want us? I want to get that. All right. In the picture.
No, it doesn't go any higher than that.
Mic back. Okay. Hello? Okay, we have to. Mic on. Okay, everyone, we have to finalize our lobbying assignments, and this is going to be grueling because it's 8 o'clock at night. So we really just need to finalize this and make sure people know where they're lobbying. I have a list. So for those, yeah. Okay, so we need everybody to seat. I have a list. I have a lobbying list almost ready made.